You are listening to an MLGA Network podcast.
Welcome to Thank You for Your Servers, a show which looks at the tech news of today, but from a libertarian perspective. Now here are your hosts, Thaddeus and Gary.
And we're recording, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for logging into Thank You for Your Servers. I'm Thaddeus Preston, aka Nick Way, and joining me as always is my man from the left coast, Gary Guthrie. How you doing, bro?
It's a great sunny day here in sunny Southern California. Getting ready to go jump in the pool and have a margarita in a little bit here, I think.
Ironically enough, it is actually not sunny here in the great Southwest. It is raining today, which we're actually happy for because it has been hot, for lack of a better word, as balls for the past couple of days. Our monsoon season has been trying to kind of get started in fits and starts, and I think finally this morning the sky opened up. So it'll be a little better today, but I mean, it will be humid, which is something we are not very accustomed to here in the great Southwest. So hey, man, this is our weekly rant about tech topics from a liberty perspective. It's not really weekly. I mean, let's just when we can get together and talk about these things from a liberty perspective. This and other podcasts are brought to you by the Make Liberty Great Again network of podcasts. And now, with no further ado, let's get into it. So, something I've been looking into for the past couple of weeks, since our last kind of recording session here, is the GDPR. So, WTF, Thaddeus / Nick. What is the GDPR? I'm trying to get it. It's the, help me out here, Gary. What does that stand for?
General Data Protection Regulation.
So this is a regulation emanating from the EU. And it has, a lot of things. It's the protection of natural persons in relation to the processing of personal data, and that's basically, it's data protection, right? It kind of dictates what companies can do with your data. The objective of the new rules was to basically give the citizens of the EU control over their personal data, and of course to simplify,
right? And
by imposing these new rules, simplify regulatory environment for compliance with these new data protection rules. It's of course it's a rule that was put into place in if I'm mistaken, right, 2016, and
sounds right.
And so basically, it applies to all citizens within the 28 member bloc of the EU, even Brexiting UK, because I think they've even started to implement certain portions of the regulation in their law. And it starts out from a good place, right? Because particularly in light of the fact that there have been a lot of controversies over data breaches, the uses of said data that these social media networks and generally speaking, big tech has been accumulating over the last couple decades, truth be told. It's funny how it took them such a long period of time for them to begin to understand that a lot of these companies, tech and otherwise, were aggregating tons of consumer data. I had argued a long time ago when I was in college that maybe we should probably have some sort of, not necessarily regulatory push down for a data bill of rights, though I hate using that term. But that at the very least, we should start looking at our data as a currency that we should trade with these big tech companies that we were given it to, and that the company that is would be best positioned to take advantage of this environment that we're now in, right, which is more of a top-down regulatory environment of data protection, would be companies that would give people some sort of say in not only how that data is used, but also trade that data for some sort of monetary compensation or some sort of perks. For the most part, a lot of these companies do that. I think Facebook doesn't. I think Google does, and to a certain extent because of the services it provides. But that was the whole point, right? So the whole point of this general data protection regulation was that it does the one thing I can't stand, and that is it now creates a new right, the right for data protection, which.
So basically, our overlords in the government are saying we have granted you ownership of your data.
Which you always
That's the way I see
had
it.
ownership.
Which you always had
ownership of your data. That's the thing. I think what it.
But they are now giving it to us. They're so generous.
And basically, what this
Thanks.
is all right. So basically, we're telling the citizenry that we now recognize that this is an issue. We now bestow upon you said right, a fundamental right according to the EU regulation I read, which. I don't like that terminology, but I digress. So now we're going to punish companies that don't comply with this new form of regulatory capture that only big companies see. Because it's funny when they make these rules that only big companies can comply with.
That's correct.
And Gary can give you a reason why that is annoying.
This is insane. So the company I work for is approximately 25 people. Okay. This includes everybody from operations to human resources to IT to sales to the executives. We're 25 people. And we deal with one of the three credit repositories here in the United States. Of course, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. Yes. I'll let you pick which one I'm talking about. It's not the one that just had the data breach, though. Okay, fine. It's Experian. And they are taking they're taking a very big step in data security, of course, in light of the Equifax data breach. Experian is now instituting their third-party security program, TPS they call it, which I think is ironic considering the Office Space TPS report meme that's out there, But
PC low letter.
They are
WTF.
They are requiring, a certain level of compliance with security regulation, all this stuff, and that they are kind of spearheading. Well, here comes GDPR, which I will always mix up the letters on. And this is not even coming from within the United States. This is coming from the European Union, So first of all, and mark my words, this will spread tentacles very cancerous-like into the United States very quickly, and you will see cottage industry pop up of compliance companies who will help you at a cost to become GDPR compliant.
We have a company like that in the show notes that is actually getting into that business. That actually is going to be a big business.
It's going to be huge. It's going to be way bigger than the Y2K pop-ups that happened, 20 years ago. But for a company like us, it's not going to be feasible. It's going to cut into our profits in a very significant way. And our board may just come back and say, you know what, it's not worth it anymore.
Yeah, so here's the deal. So to kind of dovetail off of that point, right? Because you give very anecdotal evidence as to why this is a pain for small businesses. So from this very same TechCrunch article that's in the show notes, it's actually a pretty good explainer on it. Like a major point of note right off the bat is that the GDPR does not merely apply to EU businesses, as Gary has alluded to. Any entities processing the personal data of EU citizens need to comply. And it's funny because that's very nebulous, right? Because if you look at, not to get geeky here, but if you look from a graph theory point of view, like what point on the vertice, what point on the surface are we attached to other entities, right? You may not be directly attached to a person in the EU whose personal data is protected under GDPR, but that does extend its tentacles out. Like, here's a case in point. for those of you who go to a lot of websites, and when you get there initially, you always get that darn pop-up that says, hey, there's cookies and this and that. Do you want to proceed or whatever? Or it's annoying, right? That is GDPR.
Yep.
And to dovetail off the point, in this article, like it says, Facebook, for example, a U.S. company that handles massive amounts of Europeans' personal data, is going to have to rework multiple business processes to comply with these new rules. Last year, the company told us it had to assemble the largest cross-functional team in history of its family of companies to support GDPR compliance. Specifying this includes senior executives from all product teams, designers, user experience/testing executives, policy executives, lawyers, executives from each of Facebook's companies. Dozens of people at Facebook Ireland are working full-time on this effort. Noting too that the data protection team at the European HQ in Dublin will be growing 250%. This was just in 2007. And also said that it was in the process of hiring top quality data protection officers at positions in the company. Facebook, the point is, to kind of circle back on what Gary was saying, is this is not a cheap thing to implement.
No, not at all.
This new fundamental right is going to cost small companies a tremendous amount of heartache until such time as the market figures out a way to automate this process. But until then, the EU has essentially made itself an island in and of itself to many of the U.S. tech firms that can come to their markets and help them improve things like productivity and stuff like this. This has wide-ranging implications. This is almost the equivalent to the current trade war between us and the Chinese kind of market, but this then becomes a different type of tariffing because there's regulatory capture costs that have to be absorbed for U.S. companies to do business with the EU, to the point where it makes no sense to do business in the EU. So if I were starting a company today that, let's say, let's war game this out, a machine learning company that helps automate certain types of workflows for customers in the business of aggregating customer data to do things like, CRM, right? Just to say I want to be a smaller version of Salesforce. Why am I going to waste the time as a small entity? I'm a team of like 5 guys using Azure services or AWS services to build out this kind of software as a service platform, where if I have to deal with the compliance issues associated with doing business with companies in the EU to deploy my software as a service, I don't deploy my software as a service in that region. When I can go to other growing and open regions like Africa or South America, or to a lesser extent India, even China, despite the fact that there's risks associated with software as a service in that region in general because of the totalitarian nature of that government. But at least and understand the totalitarian nature of that government. These GDPR rules, particularly once we start, they're already levying fines against tech companies from the U.S. Part of it is because there's that visceral hatred of bigness of big tech companies, particularly American big tech companies. But also it's because they just created and enshrined these arbitrary rights out of whole cloth. Let me make a very controversial statement to those of us in the liberty movement and for those who are big on data privacy and stuff like that. The moment you go into a product and give your information and they then said take that somewhat personal information and transform it to create and produce insights for their overall business, that is not your data anymore because it's been transformed. And people don't like hearing those types of things. And I always come back to the argument, kind of like the whole thing in libertarian circles, or in more leftist circles that are critiquing libertarians will then move to Somalia. If you don't like the fact that your data and your personal data is being used and transformed in this way, don't use the service. Or build your own service that doesn't do this and come back to me in a year and see if your business is still viable.
Right. This is it's the reality and the practical aspect of the whole thing, right? We deal in my company with credit report data and everything. So we get raw credit report data from credit bureaus, and in like you just said, we transform it, we parse it, we do an analysis of it. At what point, does that not become your data? Well, the point at which you submit it, I think, is what you're saying is that's the point where you don't own it anymore. You have voluntarily given that data up for whatever is going to happen downstream. Is that kind of what I'm getting?
Basically, because here's the deal. The terms of service dictate this. The only thing the GDPR does is surface the terms of service that says, hey, and it's basically getting you to opt in. Hey, you once you're on this platform and you start giving us data, be it passively or explicitly, we have the right to do, or we are going to use this data in this and this and this and this and this way. Most companies have been very, very open in the past 5 years, at least, about what they're doing with your data, right? It's just you need to surface it. Now, if that data is somehow used to do nefarious things, then there's a legal question of the chain of custody of that data, right?
Right.
Because here's the deal. Once it is transported to a third party, from the party that you gave it to, I would argue again that they're using it for other purposes. And if they paid for the now transformed data that you submitted voluntarily to this organization, then the third party equally has the right to be like, well, we grabbed it from this entity, via these third party data brokerages markets, and we transformed it again. If we're going to use the analogy of data as being the new oil, crude oil coming out of the ground to gasoline is a huge upstream process that requires tremendous amount of energies to physically transform and to reformulate and to create and stuff like that. Is it still technically the property of the owner of the let's say the patch of ground for which the oil came out of? Does it still then belong to that owner? Well, no, because the owner gave up the right to what happens to that crude oil product once it comes out of the ground. He's compensated for his mineral rights, and that's the true thing, right? Like, are we truly compensated for the data we give over? I say 25% of the time we're not. I say that we are, but I say 75% that we're not.
Well, hey, at CVS, I get a big giant receipt. So, when I give them my card.
There's that, right? Or there's points I get when I, shop at, Chick-fil-A or...
Right.
Or
Thaddeus, I think a lot of this goes back to what we talked about several weeks ago, which is, there needs to be a growing awareness and a growing discipline on the part of consumers to understand and know what they're giving up, who they're giving it up to. Instead of just blindly filling out forms on the internet, we need to start reading those terms of service. And
there's actually probably a market opportunity, and there probably are. I think there are companies that exist that actually does what this GDPR does, and that's really what I'm. There's a long list of things that the GDPR like mandates and stuff like that I would not be. I wouldn't necessarily co-sign, but what it ultimately is, and what I've kind of encompassed it into one thing is, hey, it's just surfacing the terms of service and making them very explicit and holding.
Well, hopefully getting people to want to understand what those terms of service are. Because I think that's we just blindly submit stuff all day long. And let's face it, I mean, people have been taking advantage of that for years.
Yeah, they've been taking advantage of it.
No one reads the fine print.
Everyone's taken advantage of that since the first introduction of loyalty programs at grocery stores.
Yep.
Like grocery stores, the people who have probably the most personal information on you besides the federal government are like grocery stores, insurance companies, hospitals, healthcare. This is not new. I just don't like the fact that they're like suddenly enshrining in this thing. And when you create a right out of whole cloth, I mean, someone has to pay for that, right?
Yeah.
I think it makes the EU this digital island until such time as market mechanisms come into place, which
well,
makes...
not really. I mean, the way the GDPR is written, I mean, think about this. The company I work for does online credit applications for car dealerships here in the United States. We don't deal with European Union, whatever, but I think there's enough ambiguity in the way that it's written where somebody residing in the European Union, wherever it is, but has a residence in the United States and applies for a car loan in the United States, we may be crossing a line there saying, okay, you are required to comply with, GDPR stuff at that point. I don't know.
That's fair. I mean, that's fair. And so I'll recalibrate what I say. I don't think innovative services that are produced outside of the EU are going to necessarily step into the EU. So that does make them a digital island in the sense that, like, it may slow down the innovative products and services that can be offered in other markets that have a little less stringent data protections. And and that's
right. I guess if you're targeting the EU for your product, then you're going to be. Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying.
To a certain extent,
kind of like the 80-20 rule.
And I think it'll subside as time moves on, right? Because at the time, like, these big companies they understand the regulatory capture. It'll just be the cost of doing business in the EU, but it'll definitely be like you will be slow to roll things out in the EU. It's still because it's still 500 million person market, right? It's a very wealthy continent, and so you're not going to not go. If you're building global services and stuff like that, but you are going to need to have a strategy and have set aside enough capital and personnel to truly understand what's going on there. And that kind of brings me to, like, one of the companies that I kind of looked into a couple of weeks ago when I was really kind of digging into what the pluses and minuses of the GDPR, and that is, like, there's this company out of New York that's kind of trying to build that. It's called what is it? Is it Ithaca? It's based out of New York City, and basically it wants to create a solution to help customers kind of adhere to these regulations. It's getting lots of funding, and there's actually lots of companies, particularly within the EU, that are getting kind of venture capital funding to basically kind of applying, like, machine learning and automation to this process of compliance. Because once the beautiful thing about, from a computer science point of view and in a technical point of view, when it comes to a regulation, if the regulation is not terrible and nebulous, if it is very concrete, you can code for it, right? You can code for that compliance, and so I think by this is the government, a supranational government has created this regulation that then creates a right out of whole cloth for which the market will have to adjust, and people will try to figure out ways to comply with it or get around it. And I think the more ethical way of going about it, if one is to believe that the law in and of itself is good and ethical and should be complied with, is that people are coming up with solutions, technical solutions that will kind of aid in, let's say I have my mythical software as a service startup, then I can start kind of, I can incur less costs in entering the EU market if I have companies like Ithaca that can, help me comply with these regulations, unless the regulations change.
Right.
So that's the thing, right? The Federal Registry in the United States changes quarterly, and so sometimes, you can be compliant in one sense, but, like, it may change at the drop of a hat.
It will change.
Well, I'm sorry.
I guarantee
it will change at the drop of a hat. So to add to a silver lining, right? We can continue to bash on the GDPR and it being the bane of our existence, but it does exist, right? Short of a overthrow of the EU, I don't think I don't think the regulation goes anywhere anytime soon. Most of the governments within the EU are going to comply. Its tentacles are going to expand beyond its borders. It already has. If you go through any damn website.
I think it's what you're also going to see with the GDPR is, a lot of this is going to become, quote, best practices, which are going to be folded into some arbitrary compliance thing. You know, some companies say, okay, you want to do business with us, you're going to comply with these requirements because we say so. And this happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the finance industry, where companies will tack on additional compliance requirements just because they can. You know, this is a term of your partnership with us. So I do think a lot of these GDPR requirements are going to embed themselves here, maybe not in a regulatory or you know, in a legal way, but definitely as best practices in a private contract, which I'm fine with.
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
happens, right?
Companies are going to.
But understand, though, those are derivative of government compliance on their part, right? So, like, that's it's just a trick. You know, it's funny. You know, liberals and leftists, but leftists more than anything, think that trickle down is a myth. No, trickle down is is a concept that's not just, that's just kind of in the realm of economics, right? I mean, these have effects.
It's everywhere.
You know, so you know, as the fourth or fifth party down from doing business with a giant conglomerate that has, particularly in the financial sector, there are global regulations, there are global compliance standards, and then there are national compliance standards, and then there are state compliance standards. So they're all, these things are all derivative. A contract at its very core or a partnership contract at its very core that forces you to comply with X, Y, Z. Understand, like, there's 6 or 7 degrees of separation down. Those are derived from a law, right, or a rule.
Most of them.
And the best,
yes.
and,
I mean,
and the
some
best
are
practices that are not derived from laws or rules are honestly, truly derived are lawfare, right? Or just defensive mechanisms against lawfare, i.e., legal liability, which is again law. So yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
So yeah. All right. So I mean, other than that, I mean, I think we beat up on the GDPR enough. I mean, I in the show notes I have also a technology review article that says, like, hey, maybe, you know, sites are making less money because of GDPR. And the funny thing about the article is, like, well, they were trying to be apologetic to the GDPR. Like, well, not necessarily. We mean, you know, it may not be, you know, possibly. But then they said, like, oh, yeah, the analytical tool that they were using, which was Adobe Analytics, is what is it? It's under GDPR, so they might not be getting enough data to really know if it's costing websites anything. So GDPR prevents them from performing meta-analysis to see if the GDPR has any effect on revenue to websites. So unintended consequence of GDPR. So that is that. So in that sort of same vein, but moving down the line of show topics here, is my personal favorite is what I like to call the big tech leftists, or the leftist big tech let me do it the right way. So there's big tech's leftist pipeline. So you know how you have, like, the what is it, what's the word I'm looking for here? The trope of, like, the libertarian to alt-right pipeline, where there's the, like, leftist to, you know, big tech censorship pipeline, right? And I broke down and I read this kind of article from Slate, which I don't normally go to Slate because they're terrible. But this was actually a very good article from Slate, and it basically is like there's a backlash within the institutions of higher learning that train these new tech heads, right? That's MIT graduates, Stanford graduates, Carnegie Mellon. I mean, think of big name schools that these tech firms love to pull from, that have very venerable computer science departments that train, like, the smart people. This particular Slate article kind of is following these kind of activist CS majors or activist groups on the campuses that are going after CS majors. I failed to pull out of this article if many of these activist organizations on Stanford's campus are actually CS majors. I don't think they are, personally. Because if you're in a hardcore CS program, activism is the last thing you're worried about. You're too busy trying to take a data structures class, and you're trying to understand the big O of N of like a bubble sort versus like a binary search tree. Right?
You're in the nuts and bolts.
You could care less about activism. What you do in your spare time is not like protests like Facebook in their data practices or Palantir and the fact that they have a contract. A data contract with like ICE or anything. You don't have time. Like you go down to the coffee shop and or you go down to the craft brewery after an exam and you like knock down a beer and you're like, okay, now on to next semester where I'm building like a compiler and like an operating system, and that's going to be another course for which I will bang my head against the wall for hours. This is coming from a guy that went halfway through a computer science curriculum before I'm like, yo, this is hard. And I went computer information systems after. I was like, yo, this is crazy, right? I don't have time for that. So, but right. I digress, right? So a lot of this is talking about the fact that like there's now a lot of CS students, or a lot of students in general, who are on these venerable campuses, Stanford being one of them, who aren't necessarily looking to work for Facebook or Microsoft or Google. Ironically enough, they're willing to work for Alphabet's Deep Mind. But like they want to go and do CS for social good. And they really want to kind of like steer people away from moving to these big tech companies. And then there's kind of a growing battle within these kind of social justice groups on campus that say like, no, we should try to persuade people to not even join these companies. And there's people saying like, no, we should persuade these people to join these companies and do good from within. But that's where I start to kind of wonder, what is good from within? So feel how you will about, Palantir's practice of working with ICE, right? And we can all have a moral objection to some of ICE's tactics, but the simple fact of the matter is like that work's being done one way or the other. What is good, right? I mean, something has been, Palantir is kind of more, you can kind of look and see they have a lot of government contracts and stuff, and you can see, all right, that's nefarious or whatever if you're in that moral mindset. But like Facebook's not doing anything particularly terrible other than like not being very good about, data privacy, but they're in the data brokerage business. So like what do you expect? A lot of the great things that Facebook does, particularly when it comes to their AI and their social good, and there's these other things that people are all feel good about. Like that's funded by like this data, data marketing stuff that they do. Like this market in information, right? Because there's a difference between data and information, right? Like data is raw, but data turns into information. It's almost like it's a lot of these people who kind of study this subject about data privacy and stuff like that some of them are actually practiced information scientists, right? They understand what information is. There's a science of information. People understand this stuff, right? And people know that data is just the input to information. Hence it's raw, unlabeled, and stuff like that.
Well, information becomes usable, interpretable.
Yeah, right. From data,
is just,
right? And
right, data's just bits.
But like when you have these people coming into these institutions who have this kind of social justice look at the world, in this very idealistic look at the world, it kind of makes me pause, and it kind of makes me wonder, like, wait a minute, maybe a lot of the practices that take place in these organizations, particularly, the stuff we hear coming out of Google, right? When it comes to like, the James Damore thing, or the people walking out for because someone maybe didn't use the right pronouns, or maybe on Twitter is very arbitrary in who it bans versus who it doesn't ban based on really it's ideological belief, right? It's not necessarily political, it's ideological. And so
Right.
you start to wonder, it's just like, if this stuff is permeating like the campuses of a lot of these venerable computer science programs, and these people who are indoctrinated in this kind of social justice ethos enter these corporate entities that are honestly in control of not only what data comes in, but what information comes out, then it kind of like my antenna go up, and it's just like, oh, that's why when we had the Project Veritas breakdown of internal memos from Google and stuff, you see a lot of the stuff that you see on Slate and BuzzFeed and a lot of this social justice crap on like Now This and stuff. You start starting to see that indoctrinated into how they think about how they should make products, and some of it's.
But how is that going to impact? I mean, when you're dealing with a software company that has a contract with ICE to do a specific thing, to create a specific software product, the requirements are, like you said, they're black and white. There's no interpretation of what this will do. And if you come in with any kind of social justice goal in mind to change something from within, how is that going to work? How is it from a tactical standpoint? How does somebody with a computer science degree go and get this job working on this piece of software saying, I'm going to change from within how this works?
I have an idea.
I don't understand how that.
But I don't know. I mean, maybe it's bringing up objections to doing that type of work, which sucks because at that point you're already in the company. The company's already signed the contract, so I don't understand what that. But maybe
you don't want to do the work, you get fired. Right? I mean,
or maybe you move teams or the company away from actually taking those types of contracts in the future.
I guess if you can get high enough.
If you can get high enough. I mean, and the truth be told, they are. Right. I mean, a lot of the decisions that were made, particularly what was it? Dragonfly was one. I mean but Maeve, which was, I feel, was a positive push done within Google to don't build a search engine for China, for the Chinese market specifically, where you comply with some of their draconian great firewall, surveillance, totalitarian, right? Ways of presenting information to its citizens.
Social credit.
Yeah, don't get into that. And I think that is, that's positive. I still think it's stupid, but it's positive.
Yeah.
But then that equates to Maven, which was basically their AI effort for drones, again, from within Google, particularly military drones. And I think there were more for military surveillance drones. Then I'm going to put my MAGA hat on. It's just like, well, then wait a minute. Then you don't want to pursue the goals of national security goals of the country for which you live in and are protected, for good or ill by this military force. You don't want to help that, right? So that's how it starts to manifest itself. Right. So, so it doesn't manifest, it doesn't help. We're looking at these kind of CS guys coming out of Stanford who might be wee-weed up on the social justice stuff. And we don't think that, how do they think they're going to change from within? The model exists. It exists with existing tech companies as is. It exists with the fact of soft censorship that they employ. For the messages that they allow to come over their network versus the messages that they don't allow to come over their social networks and or their platforms. So right. That's how you do it. And now you kind of see the blueprint as to where that stuff emanates from. It's funny, not to digress too much in it and not to sound terribly warlike and warmongering, but some of the best and worst ideas have come out of university. The ideas that come out of universities have killed more people than anything. And that is not to say that social justice is going to cause like mass murder and stuff like that. But a lot of these, the university is an excellent vehicle for the permeating of ideas to the elite, who then obtain positions of power within our current society, and that they begin to implement wholesale. And that is something we need to look at. I understand and I actually, because to a certain extent, empathize with a lot of like the social justice aims of some of these students. Yes, technology is increasingly going to affect a lot of disenfranchised people, or it will leave a lot of people behind, particularly when we get into our discussion about what AI, machine learning, and it will ultimately cause in our society, what disruptions it will cause in society. And so it's easy. It's admirable to look into that from a future standpoint, right? To really think about what are the technologies we're building, how they're going to actually affect people, right? But in my opinion, that's an ethicist's job. That's a philosopher's job, which is why I joke a lot that the advent of AI and implementation of machine learning algorithms are going to finally give philosophy majors like jobs. Because you should think about these things. And like I said, I understand why these organizations on campus think about these types of things. But then they start to create rights based on that. And then when you start creating rights, then they believe that the state should ensure that right.
This is the cancer that we keep talking about.
This is the thing that we keep talking about.
I mean, it just keeps
where you like the aims
keeps spreading its fingers.
Yeah, we just had a long discussion about that with the GDPR.
Darn right.
And so these are things that start to frighten me. And that's not to say that like they shouldn't think about these things. Like, and even I, who don't, I feel a lot of times that these computer scientists plus ethicists and stuff that come on these podcasts I listen to and read these papers, oftentimes think that like, yes, they are thinking about these things and these societal implications, but then they also tend to think that like, well, the state needs to come in at some point, or we need to work with the state and stuff like that.
Well, that's where it gets wrong. Yeah,
that's where you're gonna lose me.
They're like, oh, the government's gonna fix everything. No, it's not.
No,
especially when we talk about taking away the ability for people to do the wrong thing, or think the wrong way, and I use that word very probably incorrectly, but I mean, that's the reality of it. They're coming along saying, sorry, that's wrong. That's bad. You need to stop thinking that way. And we're going to do what we can to stop it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And
I am 100%, that, okay, someone wants to be a white supremacist and go have a rally. Okay, fine, go do it. I'm not going to go attend your rally. I'm not going to even pay attention to it because it doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't speak to me, but go ahead and do it.
You're not going to. Well, here's the deal, and this kind of gets me into like, I think we can leave the subject of this pipeline that I'm worried about, right? Because here is a illustration of said pipeline. Now, I spent the weekend watching The Great Hack on Netflix, and so what that documentary is about is this exploring how a data company called Cambridge Analytica, ooh, scary, came to symbolize the dark side of social media in the wake of the 2016 U.S. presidential election as uncovered by a journalist, right? And so I watched this, because I'm willing to have my preconceived notions about this whole Cambridge Analytica thing, which I thought was BS, challenged. And for the most part, it pretty much confirmed what I thought. And it's this. For those of you not familiar with Cambridge Analytica, it's a data analytics company that played in the political space. So basically, all the social media campaigns and viral videos and stuff that are for which these play, they kind of would contrive campaigns, be it for referendum, for elections all around the world, where like they told you what you needed to do with your social media strategy. And then they would actually work with a lot of either social media platforms or other types of kind of distributed platforms to get user data and to use that user data to target certain constituents and constituents for which, let's say, I think the example they gave in this documentary was Trinidad and Tobago, where they basically said they created this viral video campaign that basically convinced all the black youth, or the youth of African descent, to not vote, and all the ethnic groups of Indian descent would vote regardless, based on, they basically did an ethnic profile. Children of Indian descent, because they were trying to drive the youth vote. Children of Trinidad and Tobago of Indian descent are going to do what their parents say. And if their parents vote, they'll vote. But the more African ancestry of the ethnic group of Trinidad and Tobago were convinced not to vote, and that it would be cool not to vote. And they made videos saying that, hey, we are not going to vote. Well, guess what that did? That suppressed most of the African vote, or the African descent vote. And the Indian vote, they knew was pretty much on lock. So it was kind of using psychological and behavioral viral videos and social media to shape the narrative, so that, like, it would, for lack of a better word, suppress the Trinidad and Tobago African vote, African descendant vote. And so it was just like, so you look at that and they frame this as like this negative thing. No, it's not. It's called campaigning. It's called elections. Right. Right. And so
which is all manipulation.
Which has always been manipulation, right? So move forward to the fact that, like, Cambridge Analytica was pretty good at this. But guess where they blueprint for what became Cambridge Analytica? Guess where it came from? It came from the 2008 and 2012 Obama campaigns, where in the beginning, in the same documentary at the beginning, they laud how the Obama campaign in 2008 and 2012 leveraged social media to drive voter turnout, and they laud it. But the moment that was used for what leftist journalists and activist journalists feel was nefarious purposes, i.e., here's where Brexit comes in. Basically, Cambridge Analytica was just getting data from everybody voluntarily, who handed over voluntarily because they paid for it, and then they were driving social media campaigns to influence the Brexit vote, because the Leave EU, kind of campaign organization hired them to do so. They were hired to do a job. And it's funny how they believed that this was manipulative and that, like, data, your data was compromised to do this and stuff like that. And that's bad. But they want to, at the same breath, they want these social media companies as they exist today to algorithmically change the behavior so that we can root out white supremacy, so that we can root out homophobia, or algorithmically rule out sexism, bigotry, homophobia, by suppressing these messages and pushing certain messages. And even in the that great New York Times article that talked about the kid who went from left to alt-right back to left. So they blame these very same social media companies for manipulating people who have no agency and blah, blah, blah into believing this stuff. And then there's that redemption moment where he comes back and he realizes, oh my God, I'm being manipulated. And I really am a leftist. And I really do believe in all these, for lack of a better, these hedonistic things that leftists believe in and stuff like that. And that conservatives and people on the right are terrible and stuff. So wait a minute. That's okay, right? The fact of the matter that they actually said in that New York Times article that, like, there are scientists and sociologists and stuff who would run studies, behavioral studies, on these very same platforms of seeing someone go down that alt-right pipeline and then somehow injecting into that pipeline and that rabbit hole counter videos to counter the narrative, hence trying to manipulate behavior. But that's good.
Right.
But what Cambridge Analytica did, because maybe they played a little fast and loose with some of the data privacy laws, was terrible. Elections do it all the time. Governments do it all the time. This very nature of states in spycraft do this all the time, right? I mean, a lot of the the whole documentary made me angry. I'm just like, I almost threw something at my television, man.
Well, I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah,
but,
thank God. Yeah,
I really, sometimes I I think we as, I don't know, societies, organizations, governments, whatever, we overthink things to the point where if we just lightened up, opened up everything to be free, open and clear, and we're very clear about what's going on with the data, what's happening with it, and people were smart enough or interested enough to know, then we could just be human beings, and these interactions would happen, things would naturally progress, and we wouldn't have to worry about manipulating and doing, all this stuff that we try to, all these layers of management we try to build on top of humanity.
Yeah, to protect humanity from its very nature, I find.
Yeah, to protect individuals from themselves, or even, groups of individuals from other groups of individuals. It's like, you know what? We're human beings. This is dirty. It's ugly. And it always will be.
And it's very, very sloppy, right?
Very sloppy.
I inherently believe that. And this very paternalistic attitude that, like, we can't allow people to be manipulated with bad ideas, so we must stop this, because what you thought should happen, particularly in the instance of this Brexit election or referendum, what you expected to happen didn't happen, and now you're looking for a reason why people rebel against your plutocratic way of looking at the world. And it is the fact that they hold people in contempt while at the same time saying we're looking into this Cambridge Analytica hack, so to speak. You're on one breath, you're saying you're out to protect the people from this populist outrage mob, but at the same time, you don't understand that most those people, you're insulting those people by saying that they were manipulated.
Right.
Maybe they knew exactly what they wanted. Campaigns are dirty, nasty businesses. And people sometimes who you don't like politically win these things. And the fact of the matter is that now these campaigns have access to these treasure troves of data, which they've always had access to these treasure troves of data, and are now using it effectively to push maybe a more populist message that you're not appreciative of, is no reason to begin the algorithmic warfare to change people's thoughts into what you think they should think about a said issue. That's what scares me.
We need to allow all points of view. We need to allow all communication, because, like you just said, I mean, people change their minds, and sometimes it takes going down the path of a dangerous way, white supremacy or whatever, to find a moment of redemption that is more powerful than any type of manipulation that would get you to think
any type of manipulation or any type of forcement. It's almost like Inception, right? Like Inception is a thing that from the great documentary Inception. You plant the idea like a virus, right? And I think they believe that. I think they have no understanding of human agency. Yeah, people can be somewhat manipulated. No, it's not manipulation. They're being advertised to. They're being persuaded.
Right.
They're being persuaded to think differently or vote a certain way or whatever. And here's the deal. The only reason they're being convinced to vote a certain way or think a certain way is because there's already a preconceived notion in their mind that something's not right. That's how that works. An alt-right person or a white supremacist who in his own life has probably dealt with some form of adversity or some sort of reverse discrimination. It might have been unintentional, but the reason why that person's susceptible to that is because of experiences that happen outside of the sphere of cyberspace. And you're not going to convince that person otherwise.
No, it's already too deeply
if in their
rooted.
personal life they see mass migration that's causing disruption in their neighborhood, or maybe they were passed over for a promotion for a woman or a minority. It pervades the society outside of social media. And if someone feels they have been wronged in the real world, you're not going to convince them in the virtual world that their thinking is wrong, because you can't convince me to not believe my lying eyes. Right.
Right. Well, they're going to look, it's confirmation bias, right?
And that happens.
I've already made up my mind.
That happens a lot. I fall into my bubbles. Right?
Well, I think it's human nature because it's, the world is too complex. We can't simplify it down to something that makes sense to us and take into account every single factor that's out there. We have to simplify. This is why I think things like racism or sexism exist, because people insist that there are these meaningful differences between things. And it's like, okay, well, in your mind, yeah. And that's your way of simplifying it. It's not correct sometimes, but sometimes maybe it is. And sometimes maybe it works.
And that leads to a much more broader subject of the human mind. And with that broader subject here, like kind of just to kind of, finish up the tail end of this show with this topic, and that's AI. Right. So a lot of these algorithms, particularly when it comes to in this instance, the great hack, are machine learning algorithms. Right. And there's lots of people out there trying to figure out how to create intelligence. And like your example, with sexism and stuff like that. Or racism or stuff like that. People, what we're learning from study cognitive sciences, trying to study ways to build software and or something that can compute intelligently, i.e. build intelligences. The human mind builds these models. They conceptualize these models of the world. And that is how you derive intelligence. Because you need to be able to apply these models of the world to certain situations. And that's how you learn, right? So it's like if someone gives you a new concept, the first thing you do is you try to model that concept you try to model that concept within the construct of the models of the world that you hold. And then from there, you kind of derive knowledge from that, and then it breaks down. So what a lot of neuroscientists have learned is like it starts from that much more higher level before it gets down to
right.
Before it kind of filters down into, hey, what dendrite fire, what neuron fires, axon fires, what dendrites move the data or the charge across whatever synapse and stuff like that. And so, we don't know enough about the human brain and enough about intelligence to build true intelligent systems yet. And what you should probably take away from a lot of these, these social media hacks or manipulation campaigns or stuff like that is humans are messy, complex, and they suck. Right. I mean, remember, but they're very hard to model. And to think that we're going to build intelligent systems that are going to stop hate, that are going to stop racism,
not going to happen,
sexism,
not going to happen,
that AI is somehow going to solve these problems. No, artificial general intelligence is going to be a very specific thing. It's going to help you comply maybe with the GDPR and other things. It's kind of this, I'm formulating this kind of experiment in my mind of the type of company I could build where I could take compliance and make it a machine learning thing that uses automation and AI to take care of things like payroll and benefits and stuff like that. But I'm still going to need like a body there for HR, right? Because human interactions.
There's always that human. Yeah.
Human interactions
you can't
are
have
very
someone.
complicated.
I mean, how do you handle someone getting up from their desk in tears and needing someone to talk to?
Right.
You can't make a computer that does that. It just doesn't work.
But I think this is, right now, this evolution of the AI in general, right? It's really just machine learning and statistical methods within the circle that is AI. Because we're not going to get AGI anytime soon, which is artificial general intelligence, which is basically like, hey, if you have a problem set with defined rules and goals, you launch an AI agent to learn with no pre-training or supervised learning or labeled data. You launch an agent at let's say a website to find like hate words and stuff like that or whatever. That that is basically what AGI will be, and and it won't be nearly as, when it happens, it's funny, it won't be nearly as powerful as all these people are predicting it will be. And it's because we haven't found a way to create these abstract models of the world that the human brain does so well, right? The human mind and human beings always create abstractions. I was reading a paper.
Well, it's our survivability mechanism, right?
Because we can't know all things.
Right.
Particularly, it's how we scope very complex concepts. I just think of it like this. There's this raging gun battle going on in like some tech circles about functional languages versus object-oriented languages, and how object-oriented languages are very, very complex. They can become very complex, even though their original formulation was to create abstractions of the world and create abstractions of a process or a program so that one can then build something complex from functional language.
Yeah, what I've seen is, we, as a software shop, we do a lot of C# and all this. What I see is the people complaining that object-oriented programming is so complex are the people who are continually trying to shove in the functional stuff, the go-tos and the whatnot, into this object-oriented structure without really understanding abstraction and inheritance and polymorphism the way that it was originally designed.
It was originally designed.
Really
That's
work.
the key. That's the key. It was originally designed to be.
Is it complex? The concepts maybe a little bit, but if you really get into it, it ain't. It's simple. We make it complex.
We do.
by just insisting on doing things the way we always have.
Yeah. And so that's just why AI is very difficult. It's why AI is not going to solve all of our problems of hate.
Right.
AI will be very good at solving very concrete problems. They're not going to be able to. You're still going to need the human element to take the data that then creates the information or the graph that then will allow you to pinpoint future school shooters or crap like that. That's just not going to happen. Right? You're always going to need. I think AI will surface patterns. Machine learning will surface patterns. AI will surface. We'll be able to make recommendations based on that pattern, but you're still going to need a human in the loop.
Well, and take into account too, a lot of those things, these problems that we're trying to solve are all a moving target. There's not, you talk about identifying future school shooters or whatever. We just had a guy here in Southern California who went on a stabbing spree, just stabbing random people, killed 4 of them and injured I don't know how many more before he was finally caught. How do you identify that? That doesn't fit the models of the experiences that we've had or the news reports that we've seen. This is something completely new. How do you predict that?
Because no one just snaps, right? I think what they're looking for is all this data of all these people for which one would violate all kinds of, privacy stuff, not rights, but just privacy. And then you're looking for that needle in the haystack. And then you're looking for that straw that breaks the camel's back that could be like, aha, pre-crime. All right. The precog AI says this guy's going to go out and start stabbing people, deployed or whatever, and no, dude, that's not, it's
like trying to predict earthquakes. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny, right? And it's not that I'm of a belief that like you can pinpoint coarsely an event that may happen within error bars of days or weeks or something like that, but like the moment, there are too many hyperparameters to capture that are dynamically changing that one could pump into any sort of machine learning algorithm, deep neural network, convolutional neural network using Bayesian inference. But I don't care. I can throw a bunch of buzzwords at you all day. The crux of it is you're never going to be able to predict much. You're not going to be able to predict very complex, amorphous, dynamic phenomena. You might be able to like predict within a certain degree of accuracy the folding of a protein or the coding of RNA coding and stuff, but you're you're never going to get it down pat. And I think we're relying too heavily on these AI tools to make the world a better place. And it's funny, you have a lot of people, coming out of these, computer science programs who think they can. And that's what worries me.
Yeah.
Because
I think that's the wrong mindset.
You're building a very dystopian future that you think that the Trump administration is trying to implement. You're on the one hand, you're pointing at China saying they're terrible, but at the same time, you wouldn't mind having that type of power and control over a citizen, over a amalgamation of citizens, right?
Amazing how human greed and selfishness kind of finds its way into it, huh?
Oh yeah, it's always going to, people. Just give it up and learn to embrace the world the way it is. Learn, just like me and Gary hate the GDPR. It is the world we live in. And so hopefully our AI overlords will help make compliance less terrible. And the terrible thing about it, I find, is it just creates this regulatory capture, man. And the only positive thing I see about regulations as when they get implemented, particularly if they're good and easily understood and stuff like that, is we can code for that. Right? That's why Facebook wants regulation when it comes to social media stuff, because they just want to code it out. No small business is going to be, upstart social network is going to be able to comply with that unless they have AI and machine learning as a force multiplier. And that's the beautiful thing I'm kind of excited about with a lot of these, platforms for machine learning and stuff, is that they're becoming very cheap and democratized. And there's people actually working on making the compute a little bit less expensive. But compute's coming down in price all the time and stuff. And so, yeah, me and Gary could start up a shop with it's just us two and using the blockchain to implement, smart contracts to hire all the HR stuff, or at least the low-hanging fruit HR stuff and regulatory compliance stuff of having a company and doing books. And maybe we just focus on just building tools in the cloud that we can deploy over the internet as a software as a service or whatever. And that those types of companies will exist in the future that are billion-dollar companies that have maybe 1,000 folks as opposed to 150,000 folks. And as long as the rules of the road are clear, we can code for those. But like we were saying with the GDPR, though, I suspect, like the Federal Registry, it'll change monthly. And so that's what makes it hard.
I expect it to change. I don't know about monthly, but definitely, governments move slow, but it's going to change, and it will evolve over time.
It will evolve over time, and smaller companies will either not survive or not survive and have to shut up shop or sell themselves off blue sky wise, or they're going to have to spend more money on compliance and less on innovation,
which is a shame.
Food for thought, people. So I think we can bring that to a close. But ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to a close. Thank you once again for logging in to Thank You for Your Servers, and we are logging off. Laters.
Bye.